Get rid of it. The shout exploded through the Johnson City Convention Center like a thunderclap, ripping the air apart. No warning, no build-up, just a raw, jagged demand that stopped the world cold. The room was already alive, buzzing with restless voices and the snap of camera shutters on a frigid February afternoon. Reporters packed the seats, locals jammed the aisles, all eyes glued to the front where Karoline Leavitt, 27, stood behind a plain wooden podium. She'd just dropped a speech, real, gut-punching words about freedom and truth in a country tearing itself apart, when Daniel Holt, a TV titan with a razor-edged grin, lit the fuse. The words weren't a question. They were a punch, thrown hard and loud by a man who'd built a career smashing anyone in his path. Head snapped toward him, then locked on Karoline. The target? A tiny silver cross dangling from her neck, its faint glow catching the stark overhead lights. It wasn't bold or loud, just a quiet piece against her sweater, but to Holt, it was a red flag waving in his face. Get rid of it, he barked again, his voice a growl that rolled over the crowd, his smirk daring her to flinch. The air turned electric, heavy with the promise of a fight. Karoline stood there, rooted. Her breath snagged for a split second, just long enough for the silence to choke the room. Holt leaned forward in his front row seat, salt and pepper hair slick with sweat, his eyes burning with a hunter's gleam. He wasn't some loudmouth nobody. He was a broadcast legend, a guy who'd spent decades bending narratives and breaking spirits on his nightly show. Now, in this packed hall in eastern Tennessee, he turned a regular Thursday into a battleground. You don't need that thing up there, he sneered, dragging the words like claws across stone. The crowd twitched. Seats creaked as people shifted, a nervous buzz rippling through the rows. Pens raced across notebooks, snatching every heartbeat of the clash. Some swapped quick looks, part curious, part tense, already hooked on the fire sparking in front of them. This wasn't about a necklace, not at its core. That little cross, simple and weathered, was Karoline's lifeline, tied to the faith she'd carried since she was a kid. At 27, she'd stared down skeptics and cynics from schoolyards to stages, and she wasn't about to fold. Not here, not under Holt's glare. But Daniel Holt was on the hunt. He smelled weakness, or thought he did. He pushed closer, his voice booming over the whispers. What's the holdup, Karoline? Too tied to your little trinket? Or too afraid to drop the act? The jab landed like a slap, and a hum surged through the crowd. Phones shot up, screens flashing as they caught every second, waiting for her to crack or swing back. Holt's eyes danced with the swagger of a man who'd crushed bigger names than hers. He'd clashed with Karoline before, on his show, where her steady fire had left him stumbling once. That bruise still ached, and today, he wasn't playing fair. He was aiming straight for her soul, right there in front of everyone. The cross stayed put, a silent stand against the storm. The room held its breath, the tension winding tight as a spring. A guy in the back coughed, cracking the hush for a blink. Another zoomed his camera in on Karoline's face. Would she buckle? Would she bite? This wasn't just another day in Johnson City anymore. It was a powder keg, and Holt had struck the match. But then something shifted. Karoline tilted her head, just a whisper, and a small smile crept onto her lips. Not rattled, not weak, but calm, almost bold. It hit Holt like a curveball, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. What was she about to pull? The question crackled through the crowd, unspoken but loud. Why did that tiny cross rile up a guy like Holt, who'd faced down giants without blinking? And how would Karoline Leavitt, 27, with a wall of eyes on her, flip this attack into something nobody could predict? The answer was seconds away, and it was going to blow the roof off. Don't blink, because this is where it all starts. What's your call? How's she turning this around? Toss your guess in the comments. We're on the edge of our seats. The Johnson City Convention Center was still reeling from Daniel Holt's bark to get rid of it. A bomb that had left the air jagged, and the crowd on edge. Every eye clung to Karoline Leavitt, 27, standing at that plain podium, the tiny silver cross at her neck glinting like a dare. Holt's smirk hung in the room, sharp and hungry, waiting for her to crumble. But Karoline didn't flinch. That faint smile, calm, steady, had thrown him off, and now the silence stretched tight, a rubber band ready to snap. Who was this woman, holding her ground against a media bulldog? Her story ran deeper than this moment, and it started far from here. Picture a small house in rural New Hampshire, tucked among pine trees, its walls weathered by wind and time. That's where Karoline grew up. No fancy lights, no big crowds, just a quiet life carved out of grit. Her mom, a schoolteacher with a soft voice and a steel core, filled the place with warmth. Her dad, a farmer with hands rough as bark, worked the land hard. They weren't rich. Some winters the heat barely held, but around their chipped kitchen table, they'd sit every night, heads bowed, giving thanks for what they had. Faith doesn't need to yell, her mom would say, her words wrapping Karoline like a blanket. It's there, steady, when the world shakes. Those lessons stuck. As a kid, Karoline was the one asking big questions. Why things mattered, what was right. In high school, she'd challenge a teacher on fairness, not to show off, but because she felt it in her bones. College hit harder. At the University of New Hampshire, she walked into rooms where her beliefs got laughed at, classmates rolling their eyes, professors smirking. She didn't shout back. She stood her ground, her voice clear, cutting through the noise like a bell in the fog. That cross around her neck? It wasn't just jewelry. It was a piece of those nights, a tether to the girl who learned courage didn't need a cheer squad. It just needed heart. Back in Johnson City, that heart was beating now. Hours before Holt's attack, she'd taken that podium, talking about a country pulling apart. Freedom isn't just for the loud, she'd said, her tone firm but warm. It's for everyone who dares to claim it. The crowd leaned in, some nodding, some skeptical, drawn by the way she mixed fire with peace. But Holt didn't care about her words. He'd come to rip her down, that cross's target. He thought it was a weak spot, a crack he could pry open. He didn't know it was her strength, forged in a life that taught her to stand when others would run. Her mom's voice echoed in her head, "Hold steady, and they'll push harder." Her dad's gruff follow-up chimed in, "But they can't shake you, kid, not if you know who you are." That's what pulsed through her now as Holt's stare drilled into her. Karoline wasn't some polished star or a pushover. She was a fighter, shaped by whispered prayers and stubborn will. The room watched, pulses racing, as her past hovered between them like a shadow ready to step into light. Who was she, really? A dreamer with guts? A voice too real to muzzle? Maybe both. One thing was clear. She wasn't about to bow. Holt thought he had her pinned, thought that cross was a flaw he could twist. He was dead wrong. The crowd could feel it. Something big was brewing. That silver cross wasn't just a symbol. It was a lifeline to a New Hampshire girl who'd faced bigger storms than this. What she'd say next was coming fast, and it was going to turn Holt's game inside out. The tension hummed, thick and alive, begging for a spark. Stick with us. This is about to get wild. Gotta guess how she'll flip this on him? Drop it in the comments below. The Johnson City Convention Center hung in a brutal hush, Daniel Holt's harsh "get rid of it" still echoing like a slap that wouldn't fade. The crowd's eyes were glued to Karoline Leavitt, 27, at the podium, waiting for her to break under Holt's sneer. That tiny silver cross shone at her throat, a quiet flare in the storm. Holt leaned back, arms crossed, his smirk daring her to falter. But Karoline didn't budge. She stood there, framed by the chaos, and tilted her head just enough to catch the light. Then, with a whisper of a smile, soft, steady, almost defiant, she finally spoke. "You want me to get rid of it?" Her voice came out calm, like a still lake under a brewing sky. The room leaned in, pens hovering, cameras humming. She let the question sit there, her eyes locking onto Holt's with a spark that made him shift in his seat. "This cross," she said, her fingers brushing the silver gently. "It's not some accessory. It's my faith. It's what keeps me grounded, guides me when I'm lost. And you're telling me to ditch it because what? It rubs you the wrong way." The words didn't boom. They didn't need to. They sliced sharper than Holt's taunts, flipping the fight in a heartbeat. A few gasps slipped out, quick, soft, as her point hit home. This wasn't about a necklace anymore. It was about him. Holt's smirk twitched, a crack showing, but Karoline didn't rush in for the kill. Her tone stayed even, almost kind, like she was inviting him to rethink instead of slug it out. "I'm curious, Daniel," she said, her voice lifting just a touch. "Why does it bug you so much? Is it the cross, or what it means to me?" A buzz swept the room, heads turning as the shift sank in. Holt blinked, caught off guard by the way she'd turned his arrow back on him. He'd stormed in to paint her as some stiff throwback, a target to knock down. But here she was, flipping his weapon, not with rage, not with spite, but with a quiet strength that owned the space. She took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the crowd now, pulling them in. "This isn't me hiding," she said. "It's me living. This cross, it's been with me through nights I didn't think I'd make it past. It's who I am, tied to a little New Hampshire town where faith wasn't a show. It was real." Her roots bled through her words, those evenings with her mom and dad, praying over a simple meal, their voices weaving a net that held her up. She didn't name them. She didn't have to. They stood in her spine. Holt opened his mouth, maybe to cut in, but nothing came out. The room was hers. "You think I'd toss it because you snap your fingers?" she asked, her smile growing just a bit. Not cruel, but knowing. "Faith isn't a jacket I shrug off when it gets warm. It's my backbone. It's what got me here, from college debates at UNH to the stage, talking about a freedom you say you stand for." The air thickened, alive with her clarity. Reporters scribbled fast, pages blurring. A few folks in the back nodded, hooked by the twist she'd spun. Holt's jaw tightened. He'd come to bury her, but she dodged his trap and set one of her own. "So tell me," she pressed, her voice still smooth, "what's really on the line here? A piece of silver? Or the fact that I won't bend to make you feel big?" The question landed, a challenge wrapped in calm, and the silence after it roared louder than any shout. This was Karoline Leavitt stepping into her power. Not the cartoon Holt wanted, but a woman who'd faced darker nights than his glare. She turned his attack into a mirror, and he didn't like the reflection. What would he do now? Scramble? Snap back? The crowd didn't know, but they couldn't look away. Her next move was close, real close, and it was going to shake the room again. "Don't go anywhere, this is heating up fast." What do you think Holt's sweating about now? Drop your take in the comments. We're hooked on this story, and we know you are too. The Johnson City Convention Center was a pressure cooker. Daniel Holt's "Get Rid of It" still a raw sting in the air after Karoline Leavitt's steady counterpunch. Her words, "What's really on the line here?" hung like a spotlight flipped back on him. The crowd sat locked in, eyes bouncing between her calm stance at the podium and Holt's fingers digging into his chair. That tiny silver cross glowed at her throat, a quiet anchor in the storm. Holt's smirk had vanished, replaced by a stiff line of unease. Karoline, 27, wasn't done. She stepped closer to the podium's edge, her voice rising smooth and unshaken. "This isn't about forcing anything on anybody," she said, her tone warm but solid, like a flame flickering steady in a gale. "It's about freedom." She paused, her fingers brushing the cross, as if it rooted her deep. "Faith isn't a hammer," she went on, her eyes sweeping the crowd, some faces tight, some wide with wonder. "It's not me telling you what to believe. It's a choice we all get, a gift I hold close. I wear this to live that, not to fight it." A soft buzz stirred the room, heads nodding as her meaning sank in. Holt shifted, his edge slipping away like sand. Her voice dipped, letting a sliver of raw truth peek through. "This cross, it's my lifeline. Growing up in New Hampshire, there were days I didn't know how to keep going. My mom and dad, they showed me prayer, not to fix every mess, but to find peace in it. That's what got me through dark nights, through loss, through times I felt like I didn't matter." Her words painted a picture, a kid in a small town, sitting in the dim, faith stitching her back together when life tore at the seams. "It's not about being better than anyone," she said. "It's about remembering, to care, to listen, to see every person here, no matter what you believe." The crowd softened, some leaning in, others frozen, caught in the weight of her honesty. Holt's knuckles whitened on his chair. He'd come to shame her, but she was bearing a strength he couldn't touch. "There are battles you don't see," she said, her voice hardening like stone. "College at UNH, facing rooms that mocked what I stood for. Times I almost broke, but didn't. This cross ties me to that fight, not just mine but something bigger. It's why I'm here, pushing for a freedom that covers you too, Daniel, even when you'd rather shut me up." A quick laugh slipped out, not sharp, but wise, and it cut through the tension like a breeze. The room exhaled, a few smiles breaking free. Holt's jaw locked. He wasn't used to losing the wheel. "You told me to get rid of it," she said, her eyes pinning him again. "Like it's a prop I can drop. But this isn't a game. It's me. It's why I speak, for people, for what's right, for a world where we don't have to match to count." Her words settled, thick with grace, and the silence that followed pressed heavy against the walls. She edged forward, her shadow stretching long. "I wear this to grow," she said, her voice lifting clear as a chime. "To be better than yesterday, kinder than I feel, open to anyone who's hurting. If that rattles you, Daniel, maybe it's not my cross in the way. Maybe it's something you've got to face alone." The hit landed, soft as a whisper, hard as a brick, and Holt blinked, his mouth opening then shutting, stranded in her wake. This was Karoline Leavitt laid bare, not a loud preacher, not a punching bag, but a woman who'd turned a cheap shot into a window to her soul. The room soaked it in. Pens stilled, cameras sharpened, hearts raced. Holt was cornered, not by anger, but by a truth he couldn't dodge. His next move teetered on a knife's edge, but she wasn't finished. The big finish was barreling in, and it was going to leave a mark. "Stay locked in, this is about to peak." What's Holt's next play? Or does he even have one? Toss your guess in the comments. We're all in on this ride, and we know you've got thoughts. The Johnson City Convention Center buzzed like a live wire. Daniel Holt's "Get Rid of It." Now a faint bruise beneath Karoline Leavitt's unshaken voice. Her last words, "Maybe it's something you've got to face alone," had landed like a quiet bomb, and the room felt the aftershock. That tiny silver cross still hung at her throat, a steady light against the storm. Holt sat rigid, his hands unclenching slow, his glare dropping to the floor. The crowd, reporters, locals, all of them, watched Karoline, 27, at the podium, her calm holding the space like an anchor. She wasn't finished. She leaned in, ready to seal it. "Unity isn't about being the same," she said, her voice rolling out clear and strong, like a river cutting through stone. "It's about respecting what sets us apart. This cross, it's my faith, my story, shaped in a New Hampshire home where my mom and dad taught me to stand firm. But what ties us isn't symbols. It's how we treat each other." Her eyes swept the room, pausing on Holt for a beat, then lifting to the faces beyond. "It's hearing when we'd rather yell, lifting up when we'd rather tear down. That's the freedom I'm fighting for." The words hit like a spark on dry grass, and the room ignited. Applause erupted, surging from the back to the front, a roar that rattled the walls. Reporters clapped, notebooks forgotten. Folks stood, some brushing away tears, others nodding like they'd just woken up. Holt stayed put, his head dipping, a man who'd come to break her but found himself outmatched. That cross stayed right where it was, a quiet proof of her grit. Karoline stepped back, her breath even, that soft smile creeping back, not loud, not smug, but real, like she'd found her footing again. She'd faced this kind of heat before, college debates at UNH, rooms where her beliefs got spit on, nights in New Hampshire when doubt gnawed hard. Her mom's voice rang in her ears. "Stand true, not loud." Her dad's gruff nudge followed. "They can't move you if you're rooted deep." At 27, she'd carried that into Johnson City, turning Holt's jab into a moment that thrummed with something bigger. The clapping swelled, lights flashed, but her steady gaze cut through it all, a beacon in the noise. Holt finally stirred, a slow nod breaking his freeze. Not a white flag, but a reckoning. He'd misjudged her bad, and everyone saw it. He'd wanted to shame her, frame her as some outdated relic, but she'd flipped his stage into hers, not with a fist, but with a truth too solid to crack. Her eyes met his for a flash, offering not a taunt, but something softer, mercy, maybe, for a guy who'd stepped into his own snare. The applause eased, but the air stayed thick, buzzing with a shared jolt. This wasn't just her win. It was a shout for anyone who'd ever been hushed or shoved down. She ended it sharp. "I won't hide," she said, touching the cross. "And you shouldn't either. That's it." The room exploded again, cheers drowning Holt's echo as he slipped out, deflated. Karoline stood tall, proof strength doesn't need to shout. "This one's over, but it's just the start." Think she's a game changer? Hit the comments. We're all ears for your take.